Welcome to a discussion on affirmatively furthering fair housing in California. We will be starting momentarily. Please hold on. Thank you. Hello and good afternoon. My name is Ben Metcalf. I am the Managing Director at the Terner Center for Housing Innovation here at UC Berkeley. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Terner Center, our focus is on practical strategies for public policymakers and innovative tools for private sector partners to increase housing supply, improve access to affordable housing, and foster innovation in the housing area. Our conversation today is focused on efforts within the great state of California to further fair housing, particularly in the context of land use and zoning. As many of you know, California is unique in the nation in terms of having recently codified a commitment to furthering fair housing into state law. This is a commitment which now extends to all local governments and goes beyond decisions of funding housing into land use and zoning, which is the particular topic of discussion this afternoon. And it is a particularly relevant conversation today with the COVID crisis landing on top of a pre-existing housing crisis in which our communities of color were already bearing the brunt. Today, as many of us are painfully aware, it is our Black and Latinx and other communities of color that are most likely to get sick, most likely to lose their jobs, and most often at risk of losing their housing. Recent Census Pulse surveys have found that, for example, Black individuals are twice as likely, have been twice as likely to have missed rent and 3 times as likely to have missed payment on mortgages during this current crisis. It's also a timely topic as we contend with the federal government's complete seeming retreat on furthering fair housing under this administration and the jarring insertion into this policy discussion by a president who is using furthering fair housing and the specter of new low-income housing being next door to suburban housewives as a way to gin up support by his base in the context of an upcoming political election. To make at least a little bit of sense out of all this, and before we get into our expert panel, which I will introduce later, we have my friend and my former colleague, Gustavo Velasquez, with us. He is currently serving, recently started this summer, into the unenviable position of Director of the California Department of Housing and Community Development at a moment in time when that department has a very, very full plate with a governor who is keen to see that department and the state continue to step up to play an even more expanded and relevant role in the current context and in the context of the various current overlapping crises that we see. I actually got to know him when the two of us served together at HUD during the Obama administration. He spent 3 years as the Senate-confirmed Assistant Secretary for Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity. And I got to see him in action, just doing amazing stuff, a real reputation and track record as both a pragmatic yet idealistic leader, someone who could find consensus, but also knew when to push. He was the department's lead for all of our fair housing and inclusive work. And led our efforts to promulgate the landmark Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Rule, which is now under attack by this current administration. I am very grateful that he was able to peel off from what is a very busy day for him up in Sacramento And we are all very lucky, frankly, to have him. Thank you, Gustavo, here in California, now working on our behalf to help fix these and address these many issues that face us today. So I will turn the floor over to Gustavo for some opening remarks. Before we jump in, I did want to note that we do hope to have some time at the end of our session this afternoon for questions from viewers to be directed to our panelists. So as questions come up or comments, I invite you to send those over to our Twitter account or via our Terner Center email address, which is on the invitation which you would have received for the event. And with that, Gustavo, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Thank you, my friend, for that warm introduction. Let me just tell everybody that Ben and I have had several conversations that have tremendously helped me with my transition here at HCD. Ben, I have appreciated your guidance, and let me express one more time, and publicly this time, my thanks for that. I am humbled to pick up where Ben left off on a number of issues, especially as it relates to the topic of today's event, which is affirmatively furthering fair housing in California. And as you probably know, Ben made reference to that. Great Californians like Carol Galante, Ben, Rafael Bostic, and others worked on this so very consequential, groundbreaking national policy. And I am proud to have been in the second half team, let's say, to get this policy wrapped up and released in 2015. And let me say, it took a lot to get this regulation out. It took decades, actually. The efforts really started in the Clinton administration and did not end until the second term of the Obama administration. So, of course, it was terribly disappointing to see it wiped out a few weeks ago. Predictably, of course, the rule of law is something that has been unquestionably ignored in this administration. So the predictability of getting rid of this rule was there from day one. So let me just remind everybody, in 2016, there was one of the most important fair housing cases that made it all the way to the Supreme Court. Justice Kennedy wrote the majority opinion, a case that actually had to do with tax credits perpetuating segregation in the state of Texas. And in that case, Justice Kennedy referred to the 2015 AFFH rule as the unfinished business of the Fair Housing Act. That moment in 2016 really cemented the legal case of this rule, the legal case for the duty to affirmatively further fair housing. And I would argue elevated the moral and economic justification of it. A justification grounded on the belief that place determines your chances of success in life, that housing is the anchor in people's lives, and that access to opportunity revolves around the place you call home for everyone, rich, poor, Republican, Democrat, anyone. And AFFH, of course, as Ben said, has become so politicized because of the divisive tweets of the president recently. But, putting aside the regulation that has caused so much debate, it is hard to argue. I would say it's impossible to argue against the principle, the intent for which this 1968 bipartisan Congress decided to include AFFH in the Fair Housing Act. And that principle is that housing does equal, undeniably, access to opportunity and access to economic mobility. And we should all be thankful, as my friend reminded us, that lawmakers here in California had the foresight to take the principles of the federal rule and codify it as a state law. And because of this, we have some requirements here in our state that we cannot ignore, that we will not ignore. We have the legal framework in our state, starts with AB 686, which means that we must overcome patterns of segregation. And it also means we must foster inclusive communities free from the barriers that restrict access to opportunity. And look, we have issues here in the state. We can't deny that. I recently looked at trends over the last 10 years in new construction in California, and clearly much continues to be targeted to low resource areas, in areas of high segregation. So we have a high hill to climb in this regard, but again, with the legal framework and the programmatic tools that I'll talk to in a minute in place, we can climb that mountain. So a few of the ways we're working at HCD to implement the state law. Very briefly, first, we're making good progress on developing housing element guidance for local governments. Local governments need this guidance today more than ever. An initial AFFH memo has gone out to local governments. For those who want to peek at it, it's available on our website. Our staff are providing consultations and technical assistance to local governments, but we recognize additional technical guidance is warranted. So this fall, we will be releasing more information on things like data review and tools for fair housing analysis and best practices to address fair housing issues. We need and we will provide additional guidance to incorporate AFFH in the actual siting of housing for lower income households and in programs necessary to provide access to opportunity and dismantle segregated living patterns. We have to continue talking also about AFFH in the context of place-based strategy. So our additional guidance may include some of that. What does it mean to AFFH within existing low resource communities, which ties to the real meaning of community revitalization, the meaning of gentrification, and who benefits from it. So those are some of the proactive steps we have been taking, which will, as I said, accelerate this fall. But let me also say enforcement. Enforcement is another area in which we plan to be very active as it relates to AFFH. We are building up our enforcement capacities. This really started with Ben at the helm here at HCD, and we have already intervened in some cases. We can point actually to hundreds of units that have been approved with help from our intervention. Enforcement works. It has proven to work effectively, especially in the area of fair housing. And as we review housing element plans, our teams will be inspecting them closely. They will be on the lookout for things like, where are they zoning and building affordable apartments? Is there access to quality school, to jobs, to transit? And lastly, I want to mention opportunity maps. One of the areas we're looking at closely is the need to modify opportunity maps to help inform the housing element process, particularly, as I mentioned, in the siting selection process. The opportunity maps have been an important tool for directing affordable housing for low-income families with children into opportunity-rich areas. And while the underlying methodology of the maps is sound, and they have been a useful tool to understand how to AFFH, the opportunity maps have shortcomings. I mean, the maps were mostly designed to be used in the context of the tax credit program. So I like to announce that HCD will work closely with a fair housing task force to create mapping options that are tailored to affirmatively for the fair housing in the context of the housing element process. We have to reach that destination, that connection between AFFH mapping and housing element planning and execution. And one more thing I want to say, we need to cut an even wider swath at AFFH beyond land use planning and changes. I know that's the focus of the discussion today, but remember, AFFH requires that all public entities and programs or activities that relate to housing and community development have to administer them in a manner that includes AFFH. That means we not only have to evaluate ourselves, our partner housing departments and agencies, but we need to support non-housing programs focused on things like water, education, transportation. Those connections are integral, are critical. So in closing, as you can see at HCD, we are in this eternal kind of brainstorming on many ways we can help the state further fair housing. We are extremely committed to this body of work. Certainly during my tenure, we will focus emphatically on that. And we need great minds. We need all our stakeholders to continue helping us think of better ways to do this work. Starting with great minds, experts we turn to at the Terner Center whenever we need to solve problems collectively. So Ben, I'm glad you're there. I look forward to continue working with you, with Carol, with the great scholars and policy gurus here, because if we realize the vision of fair and inclusive housing in our state, we will be creating a stronger future economically, socially, racially, in so many ways in California, and that's what we want to see. So thank you very much for inviting me, and I know this will be a great discussion. Good luck to all the panelists, and congratulations also to my HCD colleagues that will be participating.
Gustavo, thank you very much for your remarks and just for your leadership. I'm really excited to see where HCD goes with this body of work in the years to come. And I think your perspective and approach will add to that in all kinds of ways that hadn't heretofore been contemplated, and help get us on a path towards a more inclusive and just society. I also want to just publicly acknowledge your commitment on the opportunity maps. That's been an important item of the work. Terner Center as part of that task force. Arthur, one of our panelists, will talk more about that, but I appreciate your commitment there. Before I let you go, I did want to just sort of ask one last question, if you will, and I think it's a really important question to think about, partly because you've laid out such an aggressive agenda just in the last several minutes here. And that question essentially is, the history of fair housing in this country, like that of civil rights, has been nothing if not 2 steps forward, followed by 1 step back, if not more. And I guess I'm curious just for how you think about that here in California, particularly in this very hyper-politicized moment of how do we thread the needle to actually get to a place where we're seeing meaningful change happening without inducing the sort of opposition and blowback, which seems to often be attendant in these efforts to move the ball forward.
Thanks, Ben. No, that's a really important question. I mean, you in your opening remarks, you talked about the disproportionately effect of the pandemic, and it seems that these communities we're trying to serve in our state continue to be, hammered, really affected by going back, the foreclosure. Remember the foreclosure crisis, and then the access to credit crisis, and then now the public emergency crisis. So yes, you are right that it seems like we take in ensuring economic and social justice and our civil rights work steps forward, and then it seems that we're always in some way going backwards. Everything that is happening with the criminal justice system is another example of it. But look, in my fair housing career, I've had to consider many times how we bring people together on this issue of fair housing. Fair housing issues should never be controversial, but they are. That is just a simple fact, and they are controversial because the system, I would argue, has pushed people to be in very opposite camps. In other words, people can misinterpret fair housing to promote division. That's just what happens. The best example of that is the narrative, for example, that local jurisdictions will automatically lose control on local zoning approvals because of AFFH requirements. We'll totally lose that control, and that's false. But that's why it's so much division on this and blowback, as you put it. Local zoning changes are a consequence of complying with fair housing, not a product or an absolute requirement in and of itself. So it's a very different frame, and it's important to just reiterate that point. So what we need to do as an implementator, as an enforcer of our state FFH requirements, is to work with those jurisdictions where we see often pushback, and take the time to explain the justification for some important local changes, consider balancing things out, corrective really delays made in the past in opening communities to become fully inclusive. HCD wants to work with local jurisdictions. That's at least the direction that I'm giving the staff. Now, partnering with the Attorney General's office to fully deploy our legal enforcement authority is there. I mean, that option is there, should be the last resort, and they should know that we will use that resort when, after many attempts, we observe just exclusionary behaviors, attitudes that completely will not comport to the law nor to the progress we ought to see in California. So that's something just important to emphasize. But I think that's a really good question, and we need to be mindful of balancing all factors or all philosophies. At the end of the day, we want everybody to be on board with fair housing.
Great. That makes a ton of sense. Well, thank you, Gustavo, for your remarks. We are now going to open this up to our distinguished panelists. And so I'll invite our three panelists to turn on their videos. This is now the portion of the presentation where we are rolling up our sleeves and really getting into the weeds of what is happening in California today in terms of trying to think about fair housing in the land use context. And we have three really fantastic folks who are going to be speaking to different components of this. First up is Annalisa Osterberg, who is currently a graduate student researcher here at the Terner Center for Housing Innovation, and recently received her master's degree in public policy at UC Berkeley. She has spent much of the spring digging into the best practices among the various councils of governments as they have worked to do their RENA methodologies to incorporate fair housing principles. She will be speaking to her findings. She actually is heading off, I'm very pleased to report, to join the State Department of Housing and Community Development on their staff in September. So she'll be a great resource on the other side to actually help get this work done. Next up, we will hear from Arthur Gales, who is the Fair Housing Coordinator, also here at UC Berkeley with the Othering and Belonging Institute. He has been side by side with the Terner Center on the Fair Housing Task Force, working on the opportunity mapping that Gustavo alluded to, and we'll be talking about some of the revisions and changes that the task force has in mind for that tool as we work to make it better suited for the zoning and land use context. And then in close-up role will be Gillian Adams, who is a principal planner with the Association of Bay Area Governments and the Metropolitan Transportation Commission. She has been the project manager for the RENA process for that COG. And we'll talk about where the Bay Area Council of Governments are in terms of actually thinking about embedding fair housing principles into their work as we go into the sixth cycle of the housing element process. So thank you all three for joining us here today. Annalisa, why don't you kick us off?
Great. So today I'm going to talk about the research that I conducted for my master's thesis, which is focused on understanding best practices for using the RENA process to promote the state's equity and fair housing goals. So just for some background, the Regional Housing Needs Assessment, or RENA process, requires that every city and county in the state adequately plan for housing that is affordable to households of all income levels. The RENA process has 3 phases, but the focus of my research was specifically focused on the second phase, where councils of government, or COGs, develop a methodology for allocating RENA to cities and counties. The RENA process represents a really important tool for promoting the state's fair housing goals, but past research has indicated that the allocation process has not always been equitable. That is, lower income communities and communities of color have sometimes been asked to take on more than their fair share of the regional housing need, while small, white, wealthy enclaves take on less. And so in response to these concerns, the state passed a number of bills in 2018 that reformed the RENA allocation process. And in particular, AB 1771 and SB 828 changed the statutory requirements that COGs have to further when allocating RENA by putting an increased focus on equity and adding a requirement to affirmatively further fair housing. And so given these recent changes to state law, my research has been focused on understanding whether regional governments who have developed allocation plans for the upcoming 6th cycle of RENA, which is the first cycle since these laws were put in place, whether they've come up with more equitable strategies for allocating RENA that adequately further the law's revised statutory objectives. And so to answer this question, I first reviewed the broad methodological approach that 3 COGs used to allocate RENA during the 6th cycle. These COGs represent approximately 60% of the state's population and included SANDAG for the San Diego region, SACOG for the Sacramento region, and SCAG for the LA region. And then second, I collected data on the demographic characteristics of each of the 3 regions that I used to evaluate the RENA output for each allocation plan. So this analysis allowed me to assess quantitatively the extent to which each methodology actually promotes RENA statutory objectives. And so based on my quantitative analysis, I conclude that so far, the 6th cycle methodologies have not always allocated RENA in a way that promotes all of the law's statutory objectives. While SACOG's allocation plan promotes RENA's objectives pretty consistently, SCAG and SANDAG's plans sometimes do not. And so next I'm just going to walk through a few examples that show in a bit more detail how I came to these conclusions. So when evaluating RENA output, one of the things that I checked was whether RENA was allocated in a way that was proportional to the regional distribution of population among lower and higher income cities. In SACOG, I found that on average, higher income jurisdictions were allocated a slightly larger share of the RENA relative to the share of the population, which is what you would expect to see in an equitable distribution. I also checked whether RENA was allocated in a way that was proportional to the regional distribution of jobs, and I found that higher income jurisdictions were allocated almost twice as much RENA as lower income jurisdictions, which again is what you would want to see in an equitable distribution. However, in SANDAG, I found that on average, higher income jurisdictions were allocated a slightly smaller share of the RENA relative to their share of the population, which runs counter to the goals of RENA. And when I checked whether RENA was allocated in a way that was proportional to the regional distribution of jobs, I found even more striking disparities. That is, lower income jurisdictions were taking on more than twice as much RENA as higher income jurisdictions. When I did the same analysis for SCAG, I saw a similar pattern. When you compare SCAG's distribution of RENA based on population, you see that on average, lower income jurisdictions are taking on slightly more RENA than higher income jurisdictions. And when you compare SCAG's distribution of RENA based on the distribution of jobs, you see that lower income jurisdictions are on average taking nearly 2.5 times as much RENA as higher income jurisdictions. And so based on these findings, I identified a number of best practices that I recommend that COGS incorporate into their RENA allocation methodologies in the future to ensure allocations do actually promote all 5 of RENA's statutory objectives. The first would be to put more emphasis on equity factors like access to opportunity or measures of segregation when determining how many total RENA units to allocate to each jurisdiction. The 6 cycle methodologies that I reviewed generally did not incorporate these factors during the total RENA allocation. So considering equity more intentionally could address some of the issues with the 6 cycle plans. The next would be to put more emphasis on promoting a better jobs housing balance, given that this is one of the only strategies COGS can use to simultaneously promote both RENA's equity and environmental objectives. The 6 cycle methodologies instead tended to put more weight on the location of transit, which can lead to an inequitable distribution because transit stops are sometimes concentrated in lower income communities. So putting more emphasis on job access is a way to promote both RENA's environmental objectives and equity objectives without pitting them against each other. And then the third would be to rely more on objective external data sources to allocate RENA. Some COGS use data sources that incorporated local input on where growth should go. So for instance, SCAG allocated part of its RENA based on its sustainable community strategy, which took into consideration whether jurisdictions believed they were already built out. And so relying instead as much as possible on objective external data sources can help to ensure that allocations aren't biased by local input from exclusionary communities. And then I also identified a number of steps that the state could take to support COGS's efforts to allocate RENA more equitably. The first would be to revise the rules for how the SCS and RENA processes interact. Right now, the law states that the RENA allocation must be consistent with the land development pattern in the SCS. But because regional governments aren't required to consider equity when developing SCS growth projections, this can result in an inequitable land use projection. And so in order to fully align the 2 processes, the state could consider requiring that the SCS is also developed in a way that's consistent with RENA's objectives. Then second, I believe that the state should consider developing a different version of the opportunity maps that better reflect the factors that COGS must consider when allocating RENA. The state's current opportunity maps identify areas with characteristics that are linked to better life outcomes, and so are a really important tool for promoting the 5th objective of RENA to further fair housing goals. However, the current maps were created to distribute LIHTC funding, and some of the choices that were made in their design run counter to the goals of the RENA process. And so if the state were to create a different version of these maps tailored to RENA, this could lead to more COGS feeling comfortable using them during this process, especially during the total RENA allocation. And then lastly, I believe that the state should provide more technical assistance to jurisdictions during the housing site selection process. Cities and counties have the ultimate authority over whether RENA is accommodated in a way that promotes infill development and affirmatively furthers fair housing. And for this reason, some COGS I spoke to expressed concern that allocating more RENA to small suburban or rural cities that might also have limited staff capacities could result in more RENA being accommodated with sprawl. And so providing more technical assistance during the site selection process could give COGS more confidence that allocating RENA to small, high opportunity areas will ultimately promote both RENA's equity and environmental objectives. So in summary, given recent changes to state law, RENA has become an even more important tool for promoting California's fair housing goals. However, in order for the state to actually achieve these goals, there are some additional steps that both COGS and the state should consider in order to ensure that RENA is allocated equitably.
Great, thank you, Annalisa. Arthur, over to you. You're on mute.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ben, and to the Terner Center for inviting me to this presentation. I want to talk a little bit about opportunity mapping and its intersection with fair housing policy. And in order to do that, for those who might not be intimately familiar with opportunity as a concept and in its application, I want to just take a back step, go over some of the theory behind opportunity mapping, and then proceed forward into some of the strengths and issues that we've run into in applying opportunity mapping to specific policy contexts. So first, to just define opportunity outright. We consider opportunity to be the full set of pathways available to people having a better life. And by full set of pathways, we mean considering opportunity not just in the sense of being upwardly mobile in the income distribution, but in all different facets of life, from being secure in food and housing, to having access to nearby jobs, to a whole host of other factors that we consider simultaneously. And furthermore, we also consider the set of resources that are needed to move people along these set of pathways towards success in whatever way the individuals and communities define them. When we consider opportunity, we take into account three basic axioms. The first being that where we live determines our life outcomes. And this just means that in our neighborhoods, in our communities, we can have access to schools, parks, libraries, transit, a whole host of facilities, structures, and institutions that can either limit or promote our fair access to opportunity. And furthermore, these structures, like the ones I just laid out, produce amenities and resources that can help define neighborhoods as being opportunity rich or poor in opportunity, and they can highlight spatial and or racial inequities in ways that we can seek to provide solutions to. When we set out to actually create an index of opportunity, one of the first issues that we run into is that opportunity doesn't just exist in the world as something that we can measure, but rather we have to identify proxies or indicators of opportunity that we can then measure and combine into a single measure or into multiple measures of opportunity. And we do this with input from staff and staff internally and in consultation with our clients and stakeholders. And that can be public policymakers, it can be community leaders, and it can be research and academic staff who specialize in the particular policy we're looking to enact. And the indicators we choose can be based on a range of factors dictated by the particular policy we're looking to produce. And they're also spotlighted by various research on and neighborhood characteristics that are proven to lead to opportunity for the people who are in those neighborhoods. And that gets us to what is our central requirement when we choose the indicators or the proxies that we would like to analyze for opportunity, is that they have to have a proven connection between the health of the people in that community and their outcomes, either in the short term or in the long term. And opportunity mapping can have a whole host of applications that can range really broadly in policy. The main application that we focus on at the Othering and Belonging Institute has been in fair housing, whether that's low income tax credits, Section 8, or public housing, but it can also be involved in education. So people have come to us to use opportunity mapping for admissions criteria, looking to weight low opportunity neighborhoods or the applications of students from those neighborhoods a little bit more highly than students who come from high opportunity neighborhoods. And it can also be used in targeted investment with the private sector, in shovel-ready projects, in reinvesting in neighborhoods that have lacked investment over the past several decades. These projects can use opportunity as a way to actually solve the problems of low opportunity neighborhoods proactively. Shifting to the fair housing context specifically, the Othering and Belonging Institute, then the Haas Institute, produced a report in 2016 covering the placement of low income tax credit LIHTC units in the San Francisco Bay Area. And what we found is that a very high percentage of these projects, of these developments, were being placed in low opportunity neighborhoods, and many fewer of these projects were being placed in high opportunity neighborhoods. And that creates a little bit of a problem for policymakers who are looking specifically to end the concentration of poverty and its recurrence across generations. If we are placing these developments specifically in neighborhoods that are shown to give lower opportunities to the residents of these developments, then we are in a sense helping to contribute to the poverty that exists both for these people and in the neighborhoods in which they live. And so we developed a task force in collaboration with Housing and Community Development in California to ameliorate this problem. The task force is a collaboration between the Othering and Belonging Institute, the California Housing Partnership, and the Terner Center, as well as other groups, as well as receiving input from other groups, including HCD. The goals of the task force were to ensure that low-income neighborhoods, low-income households, when they move into affordable housing developments, would have choices in where they wanted to move, that we prevented the state from furthering the concentration of poverty and racial segregation, and to develop indicators that were clearly linked to opportunity and upward mobility via the most recent academic research. And you can see the state opportunity map on the right side of my screen, in which we indexed every census tract or neighborhood in the state of California according to the opportunity index that we developed. When we first started looking at the allocation of low-income housing, we found a pattern in which most of that housing was built statewide in low resource neighborhoods or neighborhoods with high concentrations of segregation and poverty. And this is not an insignificant problem because the amount of funds that HCD allocates to this issue is very significant. It's over $100 million per year statewide. Since we have begun enacting, since HCD has enacted our opportunity maps into policy in 2019, we have seen, which you can see on the bottom right graph here, a marked increase in the percentage of funds that have been allocated to high or highest resource. And the way this works is that HCD grants a bonus or a bonus to any development that is placed in a neighborhood that we have categorized in a high or highest resource opportunity or neighborhood. And we have made that categorization considering indicators in economics, which can range from poverty to nearby jobs, in education, ranging from graduation rates to math and reading scores, and in environment, which can range from lead in the water to air pollution. We're very happy to see the progress of the Opportunity Mapping Project and the influence it has had on siting policy. However, this opportunity map, as Annalise mentioned, was made specifically for the context of tax credit allocation of TCAC funds. And that means that it has built into it several considerations that make it ideal for this policy that don't necessarily translate to any given universal policy. One of those considerations is that we created reference geographies specifically in line with the TCAC program, which are different from MSAs, metropolitan statistical areas, or metropolitan planning organizations. And so these can be inconsistent with the scope or the regions that are considered by COGS or local jurisdictions. Another consideration we made was to allocate a set percentage of every region's land mass to being or population to being high or highest resource, and that's because the TCAC funds are allocated by region, but in a different policy context, it doesn't make sense to have exactly 40% allocated in those neighborhoods the way we do. We also omitted some variables that are important, such as transit, such as access to transit, because it's considered elsewhere in the policy. And so we didn't need to incorporate it into the opportunity mapping policy. Another policy that doesn't directly consider transit access may want to add that to its opportunity mapping scheme, or develop a scheme that incorporated other factors that we did not consider in our process. And then finally, we treated rural areas in the state differently from urban areas. And this has created specifically an issue in RENA allocation or in any policy that operates by jurisdiction or by COG in California. And we can see, if we look at the map of rural areas against the map of urban areas, that this cuts through regions and cities in ways that don't necessarily line up well with other policy proposals. And so in order to consider them properly, since we're ranking these rural areas on a separate scale than we're ranking these urban areas, we have to construct either new maps or generalize the maps that exist so that they best fit a given policy, or is it so they can be adapted by policymakers in a particular region to suit their purposes. You can see here on this map that the TCAC regions located on the right-hand side are very numerous, and again, cut across these regions that COGS, that MPOs would like to consider. One of the possible solutions that we are proposing to deal with this is to restructure the TCAC index so that it aligns with COGS or with MPOs to aid them and to aid jurisdictions in making policy that's consistent within their boundaries. And so you can see on the left-hand side a map that considers COGS and counties separately without considering the TCAC region. And you can see that these regions are far less numerous, allowing the scores to be consistent, not just within COGS, but also within jurisdictions as well. There are other policy proposals that we can pursue to generalize these maps to aid researchers and policymakers in adapting this policy, and we will continue to pursue them. In addition, we have also looked at developing opportunity mapping in entirely different contexts. Again, in collaboration with the California Housing Partnership, the Terner Center, and the Urban Displacement Project, the Othering and Belonging Institute worked to develop opportunity maps for housing density and for upzoning within California. And these maps presented an entirely different scheme. As an example of the way you can construct these maps differently for the particular policy they're meant to pursue. In these maps, we weighted access to jobs much more highly because we were looking both to weight heavily the concerns of new entrants and to cut down on travel time and pollution concerns that might be raised if people moved into neighborhoods where there weren't enough nearby jobs available. We also chose a simpler set of indicators for this map, which is located at mappingopportunityca.org, so that we could more easily communicate its results with both policymakers and even everyday citizens who might not have an academic background in opportunity or in the way it's constructed, so that they can easily understand the way we've scored these areas in our new map. And we've adapted opportunity mapping to several different policy contexts. We're very pleased to see the results that it's had in the TCAC and fair housing space, but we continue to look at ways in creating opportunity maps that are specifically designed to combat the policy, the concerns of policymakers and community leaders who are on the ground and who are actually going to be impacted by the policies that are influenced by the opportunity maps we create. Thank you, Ben, and the Terner Center for having me. I'll leave it to you.
Thanks, Arthur. That's really a helpful overview. Gillian, would you update us on what ABAG and MTC is up to in this space?
Thank you. And again, thanks for having me here today. Again, my name is Gillian Adams. I am a planner, regional planner at ABAG and MTC and the project manager for the Regional Housing Needs Allocation process. And unlike some of the other COGs that were mentioned as part of Annalisa's evaluation, ABAG is still working on its methodology for the RENA process. So the things I'm going to talk about are kind of how the conversation is going so far, but they don't reflect any finished product on what the RENA methodology will look like. So as we've done in previous RENA cycles, ABAG has convened a Housing Methodology Committee to provide recommendations about the RENA methodology to the ABAG Executive Board. The committee includes an elected official and 1 or 2 staff people from local governments representing each of the 9 counties in the Bay Area. It also includes a mix of stakeholder representatives from a wide variety of different perspectives. So we have sort of people who are in the housing realm, but also representatives for education, transportation, public health, and others. And I guess the couple of things that I wanted to focus on today is the conversation that the Housing Methodology Committee has been having so far about how to address equity issues in the methodology, a little bit about how we've tried to support those conversations with the RENA visualization tool that we've created, and lastly, a little bit about how this issue of consistency between the region's sustainable community strategy, known as Plan Bay Area 2050, and the RENA methodology, how that's informed the discussion so far. So I would say that throughout the discussions that the HMC has had, they have consistently emphasized that equity and linking housing to jobs are sort of top priorities as they develop the RENA methodology. We've kind of paid attention to what some of the other COGs have done in their methodologies and also kind of reflected on ABAG's methodology from the last cycle. And I think one of the decisions that the HMC made early on was that they really wanted equity to play a role in determining a jurisdiction's total allocation, not just how the units are distributed across the 4 income categories. And I think that, you know, ABAG had what I would consider to be a kind of an aggressive income shift or equity adjustment that was applied to jurisdictions' allocations in the last RENA cycle. But I think there was concern that some of the places, if their allocation was particularly small, then even having an aggressive shift to give them more affordable units didn't have the desired impact if that total was too small. So I think that's been one area where, you know, that's kind of really informed how the methodology has been developed so far. We have used the opportunity maps in our RENA methodology. So that's one of the primary ways that the methodology is shaping up to encourage affirmatively furthering fair housing. We have worked with members of the task force to adjust the opportunity maps to include kind of some of those technical corrections or adjustments, I guess, that Arthur was mentioning about, particularly like rural areas, for example. And so I think that has been really, the maps themselves have been really helpful for the agency members to understand kind of what affirmatively furthering fair housing means in a RENA context. I guess one thing that I would highlight about the conversations that we've had too, there was a desire from several members of the Housing Methodology Committee to have some kind of factor in our methodology that would specifically address race. Obviously, knowing that part of affirmatively furthering fair housing is trying to overcome sort of past patterns of segregation. And I think one of the challenges that they've encountered is just there's a lot of sort of legal constraints on being able to use a race-based factor in allocating RENA units. And so there's, although the statute kind of now addresses the idea of trying to overcome patterns of segregation, the sort of tools that we have within RENA itself are limited in addressing that directly. And so, one of the things that we have done to support the Housing Methodology Committee and kind of figuring out what the methodology should look like is we've built an online visualization tool. And what this does is it includes some of the different factors. If anyone has kind of focused on what a RENA methodology looks like, it's a pretty complicated mix. It's a mathematical formula of a mix of factors and weights that results in a allocation to each jurisdiction. And so this tool allows HMC members, but kind of any member of the public too, to play around with what those factors are and how they might want to build a methodology that best meets the RENA statutory objectives and kind of the policy goals for the region. And we've kind of built in, again, some of the factors that have been of particular interest, the high opportunity areas, again, focusing on the relationship between housing and jobs, so different factors related to jobs, housing fits, jobs, housing balance. We've looked at kind of access to jobs or proximity to jobs, looking at different ways of measuring that, including kind of commute sheds. And so I think this has been really helpful for taking a process that's pretty complex and trying to introduce as much transparency into that process as possible, and allows staff during the HMC meetings to support them in kind of understanding this and building a methodology, but also allows folks to kind of dive a little bit more deeply on their own time, because it's pretty complicated to work through the number of issues that we have during the Housing Methodology Committee meetings. And the last thing that I wanted to talk about a little bit was this kind of relationship between RENA and the SES. As Annalise mentioned, state law does require that RENA is consistent with the forecasted development pattern of the Sustainable Community Strategy. And I think one of the ways in which kind of ABAG has gone about this process of trying to ensure consistency is we're actually working on our RENA methodology at the same time that we're developing our SES. And I think that's a little bit different than the way things are kind of laid out. The schedule is laid out in the housing element law. And I think it has enabled us to have the conversations that the Housing Methodology Committee is having inform the development of our SES. And so as the Housing Methodology Committee has indicated sort of a commitment to focusing on equity, and particularly equity as represented by the high opportunity areas, that has informed how our draft blueprint for our SES has been developed, in that the high resource areas, high opportunity areas are part of where growth is directed in our sustainable community strategy. And I think that interplay has been really helpful. And I think, there's a lot of different ways where I think our, equity has kind of been a forefront in our development of the SCS, but I think that having this conversation with the Housing Methodology Committee has really reinforced that with our policymakers. So I think that's an interesting, one area that I would look at is thinking about how not only the question of, consistency and what that means, but also that sort of scheduling issue of trying to, if we want the SCS and RENA to be better aligned, I think working on them at the same time has been beneficial, but it also leads to a lot of hurdles in terms of the statutory schedule. And so I guess those are kind of a few things that I wanted to highlight about kind of how we have been trying to address equity specifically in our methodology. As I mentioned, the Housing Methodology Committee is still deliberating on these issues. We have hopefully going to have our proposed methodology completed in about a month or so, but those are kind of the top issues that have come up in their conversations so far.
Thank you, Gillian, for that overview, and my thanks just for all the work that you and the team over there have been putting into this to try and do it in a thoughtful and thorough way. Not easy work. So we will be shifting to Q&A, including soliciting questions from the audience. I know some are already coming in. So you can text or email, send by Twitter or by email those questions to the Terner Center Twitter or Terner Center email account. Welcome you to contribute your questions for the panelists, and we'll put them in the mix and see if we can get to them. While those are coming in, though, I thought I would sort of start off with just a question, particularly to you, Gillian, but I think actually it has applications for Arthur's and task force work more broadly, which is this question of if ABAG and MTC are sort of the last of the big cogs that are up for most of the state, then the action now is really going to be primarily at the local level in terms of actually figuring out their draft housing elements, doing their zonings, doing their housing plans and programs. And so I wonder if there is advice, and I know we have folks on the live stream as well, representing many cities up and down the state of California. Do you expect, Gillian, from your work, do you see applications that are going to be directly usable? Are you, to what extent are you actually feel like you're able to be, you're building tools that can then get sort of readily downloaded by the folks on the ground who are then going to be handed the work of sort of shooting for these same goals, but at a smaller geographic scale? And Arthur, as well, I have the same question to you in terms of thinking about the opportunity mapping. I know you've said we need to build different opportunity maps for different policy applications, but is it possible to think about an opportunity mapping tool which would work equally well for COGS as it would for cities in this particular zoning and land use context?
Yeah, I mean, I think, the way that we've been when looking at the opportunity maps, the way that they're defined so far is by census tract. And so I think that, again, I defer to Arthur on whatever tweaks might be necessary to make them more applicable to housing elements. But I think, in many ways, as a local government is considering specific sites to zone for housing, I think that those will be really helpful in terms of the framework for affirmatively furthering for housing and thinking about where specifically within a jurisdiction housing should go. And I also, I think I'm glad to hear that HCD is planning to do some additional sort of technical assistance and guidance on this issue, because I think it is a pretty complex topic, and I think it's something that's relatively new to a lot of jurisdictions. And I think helping understand, sort of translating some of the priorities and the policies and the big picture of it to what does it mean on the ground, I think is going to be really helpful. And so I think right now we're sort of in that middle space of maybe we've kind of introduced some ideas about jobs, housing, fit, or different kinds of considerations that local governments might want to think about. But I think defining what that means at a local level, I think is going to be really important.
Just to add to that, and I agree with everything Gillian said, we are working at the task force on creating not just the opportunity maps, but data sets that are available and easy for local policymakers to interface with. The way, as I said in my presentation, a lot of the considerations we made for the TCAC maps are specific to that policy, but it's also possible for us to create versions of that particular map that are easier to generalize to other policies. In addition, if people have specific concerns that are outside of maybe the RENA context, that's when it behooves us to think about ways in which we can potentially reconstruct or take pieces of the opportunity mapping index to adapt to specific policies. But certainly as we look at housing policy at the jurisdictional level, I think there are ways to adapt what currently exists into their context and to make it a little bit easier for each jurisdiction to interact with and to provide sensible policy.
Great. Annalisa, did you have anything to add to that?
Sorry, I was on mute. I think they both covered it well.
Yep. And so I have a couple more questions, but I'm seeing that we're getting our questions from the audience coming in. So I want to pivot to that. I also want to sort of pause and introduce our first commentator, respondent to this panelist, which is Tyrone Buckley. Tyrone is actually joining us from the Department of Housing and Community Development, where he is now running the Fair Housing Unit in the Housing Policy Division. He actually joined HCD last year from Housing California, where he had been for many years working on housing and policy land use issues. And Tyrone, given your role at HCD now, I know the question of kind of where HCD is going with all this, Gustavo teed up a lot, but I wanted to put you on the spot to sort of offer up your reflections on what you heard from the three panelists, and give us any updates if you're able to in terms of specifics of what HCD is trying to do to advance the ball on these various fronts.
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. First, thanks, Ben, Terner Center, for inviting us and having us participate. I'm really excited about the presentations that we saw today. I have a couple of thoughts around the presentations. I think first, for Arthur's presentation, we get to work with the task force quite a bit. My main charge at HCD has been working on AB 686 implementation and the TCAC HCD opportunity maps. And it's just been great to work with the Fair Housing Task Force. All the participants have so much expertise and commitment to pushing forward the agenda. It's just been great. And I really appreciate how Arthur brought us back to the why. This is about how California is going to grow. We know we need to grow. We know we need more housing. And this is about whether or not we're going to keep leaving behind the same folks that we've left behind for so long. So it's really key and core to this work and engaging in this work to make sure that we keep focus as to what these policies are really trying to achieve, which is better outcomes for all Californians. Working on the maps, though, really given me a strong sense, and I think it came across today, that the underlying methodology of the maps is really sound, but really keyed to the TCAC and MHP context. And HCD has been thinking about expanded uses of the maps and lots of context, particularly in AB 686 implementation, really thinking about how opportunity mapping can inform the site inventory component of the new housing element requirement around AB 686. And recognizing, though, that it's not a perfect fit. We also see that the legislature has been advancing numerous policies that are thinking about how to make opportunity part of land use planning, and we've been part of those discussions as well. And I think the suggestions in Arthur's presentation resonate. We've talked a lot about them as with the task force, and I think they'll be in the forefront of our mind as we continue to implement AB 686. Gustavo mentioned that we'll be working closely with the task force to get updated maps, to think about how we can expand that tool for jurisdictions as they're going through their housing element update process. Things like the reference geographies really resonate. I think that makes a lot of sense. I think we still need more discussion about pieces like regional parity and whether or not that has value in other contexts besides the TCAC context. And shifting to Annalise's presentation, I think it really rings true in what in the work I've been engaged in since I've been at HCD, which is that we are really working with competing values that are all high priorities and values that we hold, I think, as a state and as separate agencies, but also that it's going to be a challenge in how we realize those different values in the context of a holistic land use approach. And so I really appreciate that Annalise's report starts to guide us through how we might do that in the context of RENA. And overall, this conversation is right on time. HCD is excited to see and participate in all of this work, and appreciate the Terner Center and all the folks engaged today, bringing the conversation forward, and are excited to continue to be part of it.
Thanks, Tyrone, and thanks for all you're doing at HCD and on these big challenges. So if you'll keep your video on, I'd be grateful for that, because I expect we may have a couple more HCD questions that intersect with your work that we might want to pull you up on. We are beginning to get a number of questions and comments in from the audience. So I'm going to switch over to that just because we've got a lot of good stuff coming in. And I'm going to actually kick us off with a couple of comments that I'm going to kind of pair together. Ping Chang from the Southern California Association of Governments asks or observes that in the SCAG region, the high quality transit areas that support the RENA's climate goal via the sustainable community strategies overlap significantly with the disadvantaged communities that would come up from an equity lens. The urban geography of the SCAG region makes meeting both the climate and the AFFH goals that are embedded in RENA that much more challenging. Looking for suggestions on how to reconcile those seemingly competing goals. Similarly, we have a comment in from Matt Regan at the Bay Area Council, who was on the ABAG Regional Planning Committee and RENA Methodology Committee. And he observes that Plan Bay Area 2040, a regional planning document, sought to focus 80% of the Bay Area's future growth in just 5% of our developed land area. That has now been amended downwards, but is still over 70%. This is a strategy to reduce VMT. This will mean that growth will happen in very few places, but fair housing law and by default, the RENA now directs us to give housing obligations to all communities. These are consistent, these have to be consistent, but they have inconsistent objectives. And I think the real question for me here is, it would be very unfortunate if, as both the regions and cities work to implement the RENA methodology, if we kept finding ourselves in a zero-sum competition where it appeared that we could only satisfy equity goals by cannibalizing sustainability goals and sustainability goals by dropping the ball on equity. How do we thread these competing? I mean, this is the big question. How do we thread these competing challenges and look for opportunities where we are both solving on an equity question while solving on a sustainability question? And I'm throwing this out to the whole panel. Gillian, I know you're in the hot seat from ABAG and MTC on this. So would invite your initial reactions, but really it's open to anybody on the panel.
I mean, I guess, yeah, I think that's one of the central questions, right, that we're trying to struggle with. And I think we've done, you know, what we can to try to figure out how to, as you said, thread the needle. So, you know, I think, you know, Matt's right that we've kind of de-emphasized, I guess, our emphasis on focusing growth near transit, particularly as part of RENA. But we still need to meet those sustainability goals. And I think we have done, we've really focused in our, as I mentioned, in our sustainable community strategy and trying to expand the areas in our region where we're expecting more housing growth. And in doing so, we're moving sort of beyond specifically transit served locations to the high resource areas and kind of other areas where I think growth is more appropriate. But I don't know that we have the perfect answer on that. And I think that it is an area where sort of over the last several RENA cycles since SB 375 has been in place, you know, finding the right balance has been challenging. And I think, you know, I think as Annalise mentioned in her report, I think some guidance from the state would be helpful, right? In terms of, you know, the expectations of what does it mean to do both of those things at once. You know, I don't know if it's a question of, you know, maybe we can't have such aggressive greenhouse gas reduction targets. I don't know, right? I mean, again, in our region, we're doing our best to meet that. We're also emphasizing kind of spreading growth to all of the jurisdictions in the region. But yeah, it's been a challenge.
I think I would add to that I think there is room in the regional allocation plans that have been put in place to date to put more of a focus on the jobs housing balance. So for instance, in Sandig, they allocated, I think 65% of their RENA based on the location of transit and just 35% based on jobs. So there is room to put more focus on jobs without doing that at the expense of the environmental goals. I think we can still do more to equally weight equity and environmental priorities, and putting more housing near jobs will help promote the state's environmental goals, because if people are commuting shorter distances, that's lowering the VMTs. And then I also think there's room to think about what kind of transit are we allocating RENA towards. I think it makes a lot of sense if there are permanent investments like in rail or bus stations that we would want to allocate housing to that. But I think high quality transit areas also usually include bus stops that can be moved. And so maybe it doesn't make sense in that area to be allocating so much RENA to those areas.
I'd add a couple of things to those points. First, transit areas obviously very important, but are not fully inclusive of the scope of environmentally related indicators that we want to consider. To that end, in the opportunity maps we produce for HCD and TCAC, we incorporated several, I think actually 14 different environmental indicators, which include, as I said in the presentation, lead in the water, air pollution, pollution coming from traffic, nearby waste facilities, pollution that you find in the ground, and several other things. And so part of incorporating them into an opportunity and equity lens is to do just that and incorporate them into the same index. And then it behooves it's up to policymakers exactly to what degree they're going to weight each concern, but we can at least incorporate them all into the data set that we deliver and leave it to policymakers to make an informed and appropriate choice on how they want to allocate their different concerns in a particular policy. Another thing I'd add, one of the maps that we created with CHPC, Center for the California Housing Partnership, excuse me, and Terner Center, at mappingopportunityca.org, is we considered heavily not just how many jobs were accessible, but how many jobs were in the immediate walking and biking distance. And that just aids us in making sure that we don't explode VMT in the particular policy. And we incorporated that actually separately from the opportunities considerations so that policymakers and audiences for the maps generally could toggle and play with exactly what their particular concern is. And that way, it's not just researchers kind of in a room by themselves dictating what's important, but actually having an honest conversation and interaction between the information we have available and the objectives that we would like to pursue.
Great. Reminder again to the audience, if you have questions you'd like to have asked, please put them on Twitter with an @ to the Terner Center or send them to the Terner Center email. I'm going to go to a second question here from Matt Regan because I think it's right on point. He asks, if we adopt methodologies that focus more low-income housing in higher opportunity areas where the good jobs are available, the schools are high quality, there are good amenities and so on, that means that lower income areas without all those desirable things will get a greater share then of the market rate housing. But will that not result in gentrification and displacement in those areas, as many have argued? Thoughts or comments on that one?
I'm sorry, you cut off on my end on the last part of the question. Could you repeat it?
Just asking a question here, if what we are doing with the fair housing lens is functionally allocating a greater share of market rate housing, above moderate housing, into areas that are have a larger share of lower income or lower resource areas, is there a risk that we are facilitating, expediting displacement and gentrification?
Broadly, there's always some risk of unintended consequences, and that's one that we always try to be thoughtful about what that might be. I will say in the case of tax credit allocation, I mean, the housing that we're placing is specifically not market rate. It is afforded at a discount for low-income families. And so in that sense, I'm not particularly worried about the consequence. In other consequences like like RENA or in upzoning policy, it can come into play. But one of the things we try to consider within the opportunity mapping context is the extent, the actual situation of property values on the ground in where we're trying to build policy, so that we don't like kind of exacerbate problems that are already existing.
Great, thanks.
Go
ahead.
I have a thought on that. I think that draws out one of the challenges. And I think in this conversation, we spent a lot of time talking about what are really commonly known as mobility strategies, getting folks to move to opportunity. But in Gustavo's remarks, he did he did flag for us sort of the idea of place-based strategies, and that we need to make sure that we're not leaving behind communities that are low resource, and that we have policies in place to make sure that they're moving forward too. And I think that, you know, an influx of market housing, we've learned, can cause economic displacement in communities. And so what we'll be looking for from a housing element context is for communities to do that type of analysis if they see challenges like that, to incorporate place-based programs that can help address some of the economic displacement pieces. And that's not something we're going to be prescriptive about necessarily, and what solutions they come to. We're going to have best practices as part of our guidance. But I think what's really important, I think, in the context of Matt's question, is to be thinking about access to opportunity, not just as mobility strategies, but also place-based strategies to lift communities up.
That makes good sense. Thanks, Tyrone. I have a question here from Sonia Traus with YIMBY. She asks a question that I think is directed at Arthur. She asks, it doesn't seem like availability of rentals or rents are being used as inputs, or at least not as direct inputs to the maps. Are they, the theory would be that, you know, the higher the rent, the harder to access those communities are. I assume the same could be said about home prices as well. Can you talk about why those aren't factors in the opportunity mapping tools?
Thanks for the question. The first thing I'd say is that we have considered rents and rent burden in neighborhoods as they exist currently in other mapping contexts, whether we're evaluating vulnerability to displacement and gentrification, or looking to site developments in different municipalities according to where raises in rent have been accelerating in recent years. And this is one of the kind of use cases and where I mentioned in my presentation that it's valuable to also consider adapting opportunity mapping as a concept to the specific policy you have in mind. If a policymaker is particularly concerned about rising rent rates, about rental burdens within their jurisdiction, or with making sure that market rate developments, for example, don't cause displacement in a neighborhood, it's absolutely valuable to consider rents, and something that we have done for different projects. In the TCAC context, the reason we don't consider it is because we're considering opportunity specifically for people who are moving in to developments that already have a set rental rate. And so the rental rates that are available on the ground are not useful input in understanding how those families will then do both in the short and the long term.
Thanks, Arthur. I have a question here from Adam Marcus. He's with the city of Milpitas, and he's asking a question specifically to HCD, although I think it has applicability more broadly to all of us working in academia as well. He asks, to what extent will HCD and regional governments recreate and maintain data portables similar to what HUD used to offer? I expect this question is spurred by the news that came out last week that several of the AFFH data tools and repositories that had been up on HUD's website have been purged and swept down in the wake of the rescission of the AFFH rule. I know some of that stuff has been archived in various places on the web, but I'm wondering kind of if HCD is trying to rebuild out any of that data capacity as well. This wouldn't just be for a land use context. I guess this is really also for the affirmatively the analysis of impediments exercise that the state and cities are doing around their federal funding.
It's a great question. You know, things are moving fast at the federal level, and a lot of what we see in state law now is anticipating some of that, but not all of it. And I think I know that there have been folks who have anticipated the data purge, the data tool purge, and have started to stockpile those. HCD is thinking about what we can do to offset that and to make sure folks are empowered with those tools, once again, to do their analysis. We know they're key and core to getting this work done. So we are thinking about that. We don't have any definitive answers today, but it's something we're working towards addressing, and want to work really directly, I think, with the COGS as to how we solve some of these more localized data needs.
Gillian, you spoke earlier about some of the data tools that the ABAG and MTC are specifically building out, data visualization tools. Is there anything else that's in the works that would be helpful with all this that ABAG and MTC is considering in terms of sort of data tools, data visualization tools, or other efforts in this vein?
Yeah, I mean, Sue, one of the things that we're doing through the REAP funding is trying to think about what those tools might look like to support local governments as they start working on their housing elements. I think there's been a lot of interest in trying to adapt things that relate to kind of a site inventory and sort of making that process kind of maybe easier for local jurisdictions to work through. But some of those tools, I think we're working right now with our local jurisdictions to figure out what's going to be most helpful to them. And so we are still in communication with them as well as HCD and what those tools are going to look like.
Great, thank you. I'm going to go to a question here from Jackie Cornejo, who's with the City of Los Angeles. She observes rightly that many jurisdictions today are dealing with a dire financial situation, includes the City of LA, so that while at the same time we are committed to expanding access to opportunity and especially expanding access to affordable housing in high resource areas, that is hard to do. So she asks, what are some of the strategies that HCD and by extension the COGS are looking into to maximize the resources available to local jurisdictions? What can local jurisdictions do to best inform our MPOs and COGS as well in maximizing resources to expand access to opportunity at the local level? And then what can folks at the city level be doing to make this body of work a larger priority at the regional level and to aid their fellow cities that are trying to find a path forward here on this?
Well, I think Gillian highlighted one tool, which is to use the funding from the LEAP and REAP programs, the regional. I'm not going to be able to get what LEAP and REAP stand for right now, but their regional and planning funds and local planning funds to really help folks get their planning in order at the local level. And so I think it's great to hear that folks have utilized that funding pool to look more closely at equity. And so I think that is a good strategy going forward. But it's COVID's hit us all. I think it's really, I think there are discussions happening at the state level right now to think about how we can strategize with local governments to meet these new requirements in the context of COVID, in the context of the economic fallout and other fallout from COVID. So it's definitely a work in progress. So I remember the first part was a funding question. The second part was
capacity grants. What I think you've covered it. I guess peer-to-peer. What other work is happening to help cities connect with other cities to tackle this in a regional level?
I am not familiar with that. Maybe some of our panelists have a good answer.
I mean, I guess I can answer for sort of what happens here in the Bay Area. I think we have in most of our counties, our planning directors meet regularly. And so I think there's a lot of, everyone knows we're heading into the housing element cycle. And I think there's a lot of information sharing that just happens through those kind of organic conversations. And ABAG tries to do our best to support them as they think about ways to, as facing the budget deficits that a lot of them are going to have and the staffing constraints, trying to help them kind of capitalize on what they can do together to make the housing element process better, as well as kind of sharing information about best practices and other resources that, again, can help them create the best housing elements that they can.
Great. I have a comment from Steve Menendian at the Othering and Belonging Institute. He's just observing or reacting to a comment, Gillian, that I think you made, which I think is worth mentioning, which was that you've had some legal feedback about using race as a criteria in the methodology work. And he observes that if this is in reference to Proposition 209, that in its own terms only applies specifically to employment, education, and contracting, and doesn't also capture housing. So observing that he thinks that this might be worth taking another look at to see if the legal theory holds or what the legal basis is for not using race as a criteria. And then I think we have time for maybe just one or two more questions. I have one here, another one from Sonia Traus, who asks a question: planners and architects seem to learn in school that it is important to maintain neighborhood character. In other words, to segregate various housing densities from each other. But this is the opposite of AFFH. You know, how is HCD and how are all of us, I think by extension, going to work to overcome this dynamic? Anybody want to take that one on? Can we get to those architects while they're still in grad school and maybe change their minds a little bit somehow?
I would say, to jump in front of it a little, I mean, it's a big question. Sort of how do we get folks to understand the implications of some of the policies that have been part of the lexicon of planning forever? I went to planning school too and heard things like you know, sense of community character and things like that. You know, it's the work that we'll all be engaged in. I think the good news is that you know, this isn't a discussion about values entirely. There are requirements in the law to address these issues now, and we've done a good job here in California, while the federal government has begun dismantling this to build up our capacity to push this forward under the law. And so, you know, while I don't know how to change hearts and minds exactly, I'm heartened to know that this is whether we do that or not, this is the road we're going down, and hopefully this change in policy will begin to find its way into the academy and to different places that are putting out planners so that they can also be part of this conversation.
Great. Thank you, Tyrone. We're going to wrap up in just a minute. I wanted to give the panelists a chance to offer any other last observations that they may have, or comments or thoughts before we wrap. So if you do want to jump in, wave your hand or come off of mute. We're actually just at the closing mark, but if you have the last thought, you're welcome to throw it out there. If not, then we will wrap. I am so grateful to this amazing group of very, very smart people and so inspired as well by the work that they're doing. Really want to thank each of you for taking the time to join us this afternoon, and thank all of you for the work you've been doing in your professional capacities. This is some of the hardest and some of the most important work out there that there is. This is the moment where I would expect to hear a roar of applause from the audience. In this Zoom moment, that's not possible. So perhaps you can each come off of mute and we can give ourselves a collective round of applause. Thank you for joining us, the panelists. And thank you to all of you out in the audience who took the time this afternoon to be with us. Please, if you have other thoughts, comments, observations, send them to us at the Twitter channel or via the Terner Center email. With that, our round of applause, and we will sign off. Thank you all.
Thank you, Ben. Appreciate your panelists.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, everybody.